Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that introduction. First, anytime people mention that I was the youngest Attorney General, I'm 40 years old. I was elected at 37, and and I'm still the youngest. No one's been elected that's younger than me in another state. But I'm often careful to quickly point out to people, because there's usually someone in the back of the room that grabs their heart and says, "Oh, dear God, there's a child running the Attorney General's office." My chief deputy is 75 years old, so we kind of average out. He's the oldest chief deputy in the country. That is funny, I know, and he hates it when I tell that joke. Also, thank you for mentioning my wife. As many people out here in the audience know, and especially as people who are candidates, you can't be in elected office or run for elected office or even serve in a capacity of public service, whether it's elected or not, without the support of your spouse. While my wife is a wonderful woman, one thing I also point out is that she has horrible taste in men, and she's very long-suffering, but she allows me to do this. Just a week and a half ago, I was in this room. Of course, the doors were opened up, and it was a much larger room. But the National Republican Attorneys General Association was held here for the first time in 8 years. I was elected chairman of the Republican Attorneys General Association by my peers, the first time a South Carolina Attorney General has been chairman since Charlie Condon was co-chairman in 1999, and he was co-chairman because there were only 4 Republican AGs in the caucus at that time, and Charlie was one of the co-founders, so they all became co-founders. So I'm the first Republican AG to be elected by my peers to serve as chairman of that caucus of AGs. That's important. That's important because not since there has been a Republican AG association have you seen such a coalition of conservative, strong, federalist-minded AGs at the helm of this office in the respective states. There are currently 25 Republican AGs serving this country. There's 54 total. There's 4 territories, but there are 25 Republican AGs. 22 are elected. Sadly, our numbers are going to go to 21 in a couple of weeks because we lost, with all the hundreds of millions of dollars spent by special interests and billionaires in Virginia, we lost the Virginia AG's race. I think 2.2 million votes, and Adam was around a 100-vote margin. And Ken Cuccinelli, who ran for governor, was here in this room a week and a half ago, and we were talking about that. And it was just a tidal wave of money from these special interests and these billionaires. And Terry McAuliffe was elected governor, and we lost that race. But we have the opportunity in this coming cycle to pick up 3 open Democratic seats and add 3 Republican AGs to it. We're also defending 14 Republican office holders across the country. So this is a big year for the Republican AGs. If you get a chance to Google it, it's called The Last Readout, and it's got a picture of Pam Bondi, Greg Abbott, myself, and Ken Cuccinelli in a foxhole, but it's not just about the 4 of us, it's about all the AGs. And the reason it has us in a foxhole and calls us The Last Readout is because the Republican AG truly is the last line of defense in a growing federal government. Fred Barnes was interviewing each of us when he wrote this article this past summer, and it's a very good article. It highlights what the AGs are doing. And in the article, or in the interview, he asked me, he says, now, it's kind of interesting. I've never seen the Republican AGs become so activist, more so than they ever have been before. And I stopped him right there because I kind of reject the activist label, because that's something that conservative-minded people usually hit liberals for being. They're being activists and going above and beyond the prescribed lanes that were given to them in their respective offices. And I say, listen, I'm not an activist AG. I'm a reactivist AG. There's a difference. When someone swings at my head to punch me, I'm going to block and defend myself. Well, the same is true in my position as Attorney General. When I ran for this job, I was running as a chief law enforcement and chief prosecutor for South Carolina. I wasn't looking to be chief defender of the Constitution. Every single week I wake up and there's something that the federal government is doing to encroach on state liberty or state sovereignty or individual liberty. And so I was telling Fred, and I talk about it in the article, and I've said this in multiple speeches, but this is kind of a silly, campy way to describe how I feel about the federal government. But I grew up in the 80s, and my dad subjected me. I think DSS would probably rule him in these days for making me do this, but he forced me to watch cheesy horror movies from the 1950s. There was one horror movie that I remember I watched it 100 times. It was in the 1950s, starring Steve McQueen. It was called The Blob. First off, everyone here knows who Steve McQueen is, right? Because when I talk to college students, crickets. Like, no one knows who Steve McQueen is. But I remember this movie. The movie The Blob begins with a meteorite landing in a field, and the meteorite pops open, and this little ball of jelly the size of a grapefruit rolls out. A homeless man happens upon it, picks it up with a stick, and for those older folks out there, what happens? Blob jumps on him, right? And the guy screams, bad special effects, but the blob eats him. The blob goes from this big to this big. And then the next hour and a half of the movie, the blob is rolling around this small town, consuming rats, cats, dogs, mice, people, anything in its path. The blob eats and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And throughout the movie, Steve McQueen is doing everything he can to save the town and stop the blob. And the final scene of the movie ends up with the blob is now, all the people are in a diner, and the blob is what? It's the size of a diner. It's the size of a house, because it has just rolled along and consumed and eaten and grown, and now it is completely covering this diner, and it's trying to break into the glass to eat the people inside. Eventually, Steve McQueen and the Army stopped the blob by what? Freezing it. Now, y'all are starting to see parallels here, right? And then they take the blob, and they take it out to the Arctic Ocean, and they drop the frozen blob in the Arctic Ocean, and will remain frozen forever. And that's how I see the role of the AG these days, is that we're kind of the modern-day Steve McQueen. I'm Attorney General McQueen. My job is to stop the blob, except here the blob is not a little ball of jelly. It's a growing, expansive government that is rolling along and consuming and devouring. But instead of eating people, it's rolling along and it's consuming individual liberty. It's devouring state sovereignty. It's destroying and breaking down individualism. It is taking away the very things that make this country great. It's eroding the free market system. And this blob, this federal juggernaut, this government is just rolling along, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And organisms that consume like that never stop eating. They never stop growing. They only stop when something external stops them, freezes them, so to speak. And oftentimes I've lamented, or I should say joked, that I would love to take Congress and drop them in the Arctic Ocean to freeze them, but that is not the tool I have at my disposal. What I have at my disposal is the ability to bring suits on behalf of the state of South Carolina. The governor, congressmen, senators, state officials are very important in their respective roles, but only one elected official can bring lawsuits on behalf of a state, and that is the Attorney General. Recognizing the role of federalism and the roles that states play in this federal-state partnership is vitally important. Too many AGs are derelict in that. They don't recognize that. In fact, they're complicit in the federal government. And one thing that I have constantly said is that if not me, then who? When I took office, Obamacare was already rolling along. We had the lawsuit. We took it from Florida all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And while we lost on a technicality, the Supreme Court had to disagree with the president on the definition of this being a tax or not in order to pass it. But we were able to carve out Medicaid expansion as mandated by the Act. We were able to curb the use of the commerce power, and we won all the other arguments we made. And then on the heels of that, you had the National Labor Relations Board, which was basically trying to punish Boeing for making a personal private business decision. The AGs rallied around that. You had the EPA trying to do with unelected bureaucrats what they couldn't get accomplished with the elected members of Congress in the legislative branch of government, and that is to try to rule you through administrative fiat by unelected bureaucrats, by imposing EPA regulations and the very same types of regulations they couldn't pass in an elected body in the legislature of the Congress. So that's what they're doing. They're going to the regulators now. A little tiny law, as President Brennan, as I call him, mentioned earlier, Dodd-Frank. And I'll close with this issue. Dodd-Frank is probably every bit as nefarious, if not more so, than Obamacare. It's just not as easily understood by the average person because they don't think it's going to affect them. They think of it as about big banks and Wall Streets. But when you look at what Dodd-Frank will do, every single dollar that a small community bank or a big bank has to spend on regulatory compliance, that's 10 less dollars that they can loan a young couple buying their first home, a couple who wants to start a small business with a small business loan, or a student who wants to get an education by getting a student loan. They are completely ignoring the separation of powers. They're ignoring due process. I'm not going to go into a legal dissertation on why Dodd-Frank is bad, only to say this. Like Obamacare, it's over 2,000 pages long, and nowhere in the 2,000-plus pages does it mention a restriction on Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, two of the primary entities responsible for the crisis that led to Dodd-Frank's implementation. That's what the federal government's doing. They're trying to fix everything through massive one-size-fits-all legislation that breaks down the barriers between the role of the states and the role of the federal government. That is my job as Attorney General. That is my job as your Attorney General. And that's what we will continue to do. I was told I had 10 minutes. I think my time has expired. I didn't know if anyone wanted to ask a question. Do we have a time for questions? Do you want me to? I'm happy to answer any questions, and if you don't, I can ramble or I can shut up. All right.
The microphone is here, so we're ready.
Okay. Question, anyone? I see we have some members of the General Assembly, House members, senators in the back. We have candidates for statewide office. There are a lot of people out here who've offered themselves up for public service in some capacity, and I want to thank them. We have a lot of good members in the conservative caucus, as I call it, in our General Assembly. If it wasn't for them, we couldn't pass a lot of the things that'll give me the power to do the things I need to do. In addition to Dodd-Frank and Obamacare, we had the voter ID lawsuit, which was a terribly maligned issue, and it was it basically got race-baited last year, and it had nothing to do with race. It had everything to do with the state trying to protect the electoral process. This actually ultimately led to the United States Supreme Court striking a part of the Voting Rights Act, which was clearly unconstitutional and punished states for things that the state had done 50, 60, 70 years ago. And I'm very proud of that. That was another major issue that we were involved with. I was sitting over at the table here earlier, and Orrin, my very good friend Orrin, walked up to me and he put me on the spot. I'm not one of these pledge signers. I'm not a guy who signs things that's, because I just feel like I'll let my actions speak for themselves. But Orrin said they had this placard over here where you pledge to defend and fight for federalism, and he put in front of me may I read it?
Please. Thank you.
It says, "I pledge to do all I can as an elected official to enact or promote legislation that honors our Constitution and returns power and taxing decisions over to Medicaid, education, and transportation to the states and to the people." None of the things in this statement apply directly to the Attorney General because we don't pass laws, but I'm already doing everything I can to defend those who are passing the laws and protect that legislation. So I have no problem signing something that I feel like I'm already doing. So I'm going to step down here in 1 second and sign the pledge